Hey, it's Tom here and welcome back to the channel. So the portfolio updates for many of the large investors in the US seem to just keep rolling out. About a month ago, we had a very early 13F from Charlie Munger. Just last week, we had all the rest of the 13F filings revealed for many of the large investors in the US that I followed. And we now this week have a portfolio update from Phil Town. Now, Phil Town has portfolio updates that are notoriously difficult to find. He doesn't file a traditional 13F. His Rule 1 fund sort of falls under the blanket of another entity called the World Funds Trust, I think it is. And these filings are really difficult to find because they're kind of piled in with all these other World Funds Trust SEC filings. But nonetheless, we've tracked it down. I have to give a big shout out to Brad Kellner actually for sending me the latest filing. And I actually have to give a second shout out to Brad for also sending me his spreadsheet, which basically compares what Phil Town's filings looked like a quarter ago and 2 quarters ago and 3 quarters ago and so on versus what they look like today, so that we can kind of track the changes over time. So in this video, I'm going to go through Phil Town's latest portfolio. This is as of the 31st of March, all of this information. The interesting thing we also get with Phil Town's portfolio updates is actually not only his shares that he sort of owns, but we also get to see his cash position, and we also get to see any options contracts that he's written as well, which is very rare to see from most investment sort of portfolio updates that we get. So let's go through all of that in today's video. I do hope you enjoy. If you do, please hit like and hit subscribe, but for now, let's get straight into it. Okay, so the highlights from Phil Town's portfolio for the past several updates have had kind of 2 core themes. Now, the first theme is basically that he still has a very, very large percentage of the portfolio not invested. He has it either in cash or in some sort of short-term securities, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail in this video. And that sort of remains the theme for this latest update from Phil Town. So depending on the filing type that we get from the Rule 1 fund, sometimes we get sort of different levels of clarity on the actual cash holdings in the portfolio. This is one of the ones where we don't get sort of a direct cash number, but we do get like a other assets number, which we have to assume would include mostly cash. And if we look through the latest update for Phil Town, we see that he has about $88 million as of the 31st of March in stocks. He has about just under $8 million in money market funds, which is effectively another form of cash. And he also has just under $30 million in what's called other assets net of liabilities, which again, we have to kind of assume, I think, is mostly cash. So we have about $89 million roughly invested, and we have about $37 million still in cash and money market funds. So very much Phil Town is still waiting for this big kind of correction that he's been talking about pretty much as long as I've been investing at this point. He's been really waiting for a big crash. He did get to put quite a bit of money to work last March when the market did dip down, but it rebounded so quickly with a lot of the sort of Federal Reserve action that he really didn't get to put as much money to work as he would have liked. But nonetheless, he has made some investments, and many of them have actually worked out quite well, which we will of course talk through in this video. Now, if we look through the current stock investments for Phil Town, I'll just go through kind of top to bottom what's in the filing. We have about $6.5 million in Gildan Activewear, which is a business that Phil Town has kind of been in and out of for several years. Actually, he's talked about it on his podcast in the past a few times as well, and often gives Gildan as an example of a business with sort of a moat, as in it's the low-cost producer of clothing, so the low-cost producer in its industry. So about $6.5 million in Gildan Activewear, about $4.1 million in Sturm Ruger & Co., which my understanding is that's a gun business, about $3.5 million in Ulta Beauty, $1.4 million in Sanderson Farms, about $17 million in Bank OZK, which has been Phil Town's largest position for some time now and sort of remains his largest position as Bank OZK, $17 million. He's got Berkshire Hathaway at a little over $4 million, the Boeing Company at just under $13 million, which again has been one of Phil Town's larger positions for some time now, and again, that remains the case here. We have $9 million in Huntington Ingalls Industries, which I believe is like a warship builder in the US. That was a relatively new one just in the last quarter or two, but that continues to be a position for Phil Town. We've got about $1 million position, which is actually a new one in Barrick Gold, which we'll talk about a little bit more shortly. About $13.4 million in CF Industries, which is a producer, again, one of these companies with the low-cost producer kind of moat, as Philtown sees it. CF Industries basically produce nitrogen fertilizer, and they're able to do it at a low cost, basically due to the fact that they have access to very low-cost natural gas, and that's a massive component of the urea fertilizer kind of production process. So continues to have a big holding in CF Industries. He's also got about $5.4 million in Armada Hoffler properties. And then we get into about a $4.8 million position in Spider Gold shares, which is basically a gold ETF. And then we get into the money market funds and the cash and some of the put options, which I'll talk about towards the end of this video. So in terms of how that compares against the last quarter for Philtown's portfolio, basically the top 6 positions have no change. So Banco ZK, CF Industries, Boeing, Huntington Ingalls, Gildan Activewear, and Armada Hoffler all have no change in shareholding. So those remain the 6 largest positions in the portfolio. And there's been no change, like I say, to that. So next up we have the Spider Gold ETF. That one has actually been added to. Now I'll talk about gold and also silver a little bit later in this video, because I do have some thoughts on some of those things there and what I think Philtown might be doing. But a slight addition to the Spider Gold ETF. Sturm & Ruger, we saw no change. Berkshire Hathaway, no change. Ulta Beauty, no change. And then we have 2 new stocks, and both of these new stocks are not big, like very high conviction bets where Philtown's put 20% of the portfolio in or something like he sometimes does. Rather, they are both only about 1% positions, and those are in Sanderson Farms, which is a poultry producer, is my understanding, and also Barrick Gold, which again is another one of these precious metal investments that seems to be popping up in Philtown's portfolio, which we'll talk about very shortly. So in terms of sort of the core portfolio for the Rule 1 fund, there's really no massive changes and no big surprises for me personally. The new positions being Barrick Gold. Barrick Gold, I think, is something that falls into this sort of precious metal store of value component of the portfolio, which I'll talk about in a sec. So really the only sort of, high quality business type position that I think Philtown has really added here is Sanderson Farms, and that again is actually not one that's all that surprising to me. You'll see in Brad's spreadsheet here that he hasn't owned Sanderson Farms before, at least in the last 5 quarters that we've got records for, but we have actually seen Philtown write put options on Sanderson Farms before. So presumably he's written some put options. The Sanderson Farms share price has gotten down to a point where he's obligated to buy those shares, and that's why it's now appeared as a holding for Philtown. But really not a large position, and certainly not something that he's taking a big swing at in the portfolio. The other thing we continue to see with Philtown's portfolio is that he's making use of writing options. Now, largely, Philtown has taken the strategy of writing a number of put option contracts, and I've had some subscribers reach out after previous videos that I've put up on Philtown's portfolio, kind of explaining what they think Philtown is doing here, and that's been really helpful, so I appreciate everyone who's made the effort to do that. But largely, my understanding here is that Philtown is basically writing put options on businesses that he would like to own at a certain price anyway. And basically what that allows him to do is if he's got a business on his watch list which really is not quite at a price where he would be willing to buy it, he can write an option, a put option on those businesses. He can receive some premium money from writing that option, and if the price never goes down to that point, he basically gets some consistent cash flow coming in from writing these put options, which are basically insurance contracts on the share prices of these different businesses. Now, if the share price for those companies does go down to the strike price at which he's written some of these put options, basically he's obligated to buy those shares, and he's buying those shares at prices where he would essentially be willing to start buying into them anyway. So it's a really nice way for Philtown to try and create some extra return, try and reduce his cost basis even when he does buy into these businesses, and try and get some money continuing to come in the door even when he's not fully invested and he's got a large chunk of the portfolio in cash. So in terms of some of the names that come through there, we've got some interesting put options that have been written. So we've got an iShares Silver ETF, a small put options contract written on that. And again, I'll talk about the precious metal stuff towards the end of this video. Interestingly, we've actually got some put options written on the S&P 500. Now, This one did confuse me a little bit, so if you've got thoughts on this, I would like to hear that down in the comments below. Again, this seems like one of those macro kind of bets for Philtown, and it's interesting to me that he's kind of making a lot of these macro bets where traditionally he comes from like a Warren Buffett, you know, focus on individual businesses kind of school of thought. But that one's in there. The part that did confuse me a little bit is when I look up the Spider S&P 500 ETF, which these options are written on, the share price is like something like $400 a share, but the exercise price in this filing is like $3,500. So perhaps that's actually related to the S&P 500 index. I'm not quite sure. If you know the answer to that, definitely drop that down in the comments below. Probably the biggest highlight here in terms of a new business is actually Sprouts Farmers Market. So he's written some put options on Sprouts Farmers Market at $28 a share. Again, he's written put options on Sturm, Ruger & Co. and the Boeing company. He's actually done a couple of times, so continues to keep writing options on Boeing. He actually talked about that in a recent shareholder letter. Philtown basically felt that the contracted cash flows they were getting from their defense business at Boeing was worth about $100 a share, and he was basically getting the rest of the company for free when it got down to very distressed prices. So he continues to like Boeing and continues to write options on it. Many of these put option contracts are actually quite short term, so a lot of them have already expired as of filming this video. They expired in April 2021, but he does have a much longer put options contract on Boeing company in one of those two contracts that he's written, which expires in January 2022, so that's a longer term one there. In terms of call options, he's only got one contract on there, and that is with Sturm, Ruger & Co. at an exercise price of $77.50. So that's where the overall portfolio is sitting for Philtown. Again, we see a mix of about 8 or 10 kind of core positions in the portfolio from just, you know, traditional Philtown like stock investments. But again, we continue to see some other interesting stuff around the edges. So we've got this massive cash position. We continue to see largely put options, but also one call option this quarter written as well. But really the thing that stands out as kind of most unusual and most kind of interesting to me is the continued holdings from Philtown in gold stocks and gold ETFs. We even saw put options on the S&P 500 and put options on a silver ETF. So, you know, what on earth is Philtown doing with some of these precious metal positions? Well, I'll give you my thoughts on it. Again, I'm a long time kind of Philtown follower, and frankly, he's really never talked or written about a lot of this stuff in his books or on his podcast. I've listened to every episode of his podcast ever, I think, and I've also read all 3 of his books, and he didn't mention gold or silver in any one of those, I don't think. So it's really kind of uncharacteristic on the surface of things, at least, to see some of these positions in Philtown's portfolio. Now, I do know that particularly over recent times, Philtown has become quite an avid follower of Ray Dalio. I know Ray Dalio is a person he's respected for a long period of time, but he's started to talk more macro and more about Ray Dalio in the last year or two. I have kind of noticed that theme a little bit. And this is basically the way that I see some of these precious metal positions. I basically see them as an alternate store of value for Philtown. I know that Philtown likes to have a big cash position so that he can take advantage of distressed share prices and big dislocations and crashes in share markets, and I don't think that's changed. What I do think has changed somewhat is Philtown's view of the future of the US dollar. He thinks that the Federal Reserve are printing just such an enormous amount of money that inflation is very likely. And if Philtown and Ray Dalio are kind of right on that theory, that puts Philtown's strategy in kind of an awkward position. If he's got all this cash sitting on the sidelines, then the purchasing power of those dollars is going to basically disappear more and more over a period of time. So I think that Philtown probably sees things like gold and silver as a nice alternative to cash. I really don't think that Philtown views holding gold or silver as a really attractive long-term investment or anything. I think that if share prices got distressed enough or low enough in many of the businesses that he liked, I think we'd probably see him put a lot of that cash to work and then also convert that gold and silver holding into more cash to buy shares in more businesses. I do think if share prices got low enough, that's what we probably would see from Philtown. But in the meantime, my view at least is that he's probably seen gold and silver as just an alternative to holding US dollars. But nonetheless, this is a super interesting one to follow along with. If you've got thoughts on what Phil Town is up to, definitely drop them down in the comments below. Also go over and check out Brad's channel. Again, thank you to Brad for sharing the filing and also your spreadsheet with me to allow me to put this video together. All of that will be linked down in the description if you want to check out Brad's channel or his video, or any of the SEC filings. That will be down in the description, so feel free to check that one out. But that's it from me today. If you did enjoy the video, please hit like and hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.